Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Annemarie O'Dwyer. I'm one of the co-directors of Neurodiversity in Education, and I'm here today to share some of my research insights. So this is a little snapshot from my own PhD dissertation that I completed in 2020. I can't believe it'll be 5 years soon. So this is one of the findings. Which looked at education policy, performativity, and the rise of the cult of the performative neurodivergent teacher. I'll explain those concepts as we go along. So I thought I'd start by just telling you a little bit about me. I taught for 11 years in the further education sector as a sociology teacher, head of sociology, and did also a cross-college middle management role. As e-learning manager in one of the colleges I've worked. So I've worked in general FE colleges and sixth form. So I left teaching to pursue my PhD, and since that time really what I wanted to do was put my research into practice. So I set up my own business, Neurodivergent Insider. And I called it that because I had a background in terms of the context of working in education and of being neurodivergent myself. So I have been formally diagnosed with dyslexia and dyspraxia, and recently screened for autism and ADHD, of which I display like characteristics associated with that. Identify as neurodivergent though, and so it was the right name for my business in terms of the intention is to work, working with the education sector to raise awareness about the neurodivergent workforce in teaching, and really to offer kind of guidance around policy writing in relation to equity and inclusion policy, and in processes and protocols around reasonable adjustments, and also to offer training about how you can make your education workplace more neuroaffirming rather than just neuroaccommodating. So that's a little bit about me, and also working with a great my co-directors Simon, Isaac and Rachel as part of Neurodiversity in Education. So very excited to share my little snapshot into my research, and I hope you find it interesting. Okay, so as all good all good presentations should start, we're giving you a little snapshot of what will be covered. I think my pitch has actually cut off some of this, so but I'll say it to you. I'll explain it to you. So we're going to be looking at a brief introduction, and this is really about why I chose my particular research area. Then insight into looking at the theoretical framework and methodology that I adopted, and then just a little a kind of an appreciation of the things that are not really thought about when you consider taking on something like a piece of research, and it's not talked about, but basically this research in motion is about just the endurance that you need to be able to fulfill any piece of research. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and then have a go at data analysis. So I've got I thought it'd be nice to have a little activity. Once a teacher, always a teacher. And you'll be presented with some quotes, and the idea of using that kind of thematic analysis process, being able to draw out what those three participants are saying, and what do they have in common, what are they trying to tell us, and seeing if there are any commonalities. So drawing that. So it's only a little exercise, but I thought it might be quite good. And then looking at codes and formation. And looking at codes and formation of theme, that's the bit you can't see. And finally, one of the findings, which is the cult of the performative teacher, with an added consideration of cult of the performative neurodivergent teacher. So great, that's just to kind of set out what I'm going to be doing. So as a way of kind of introduction into my research, as I already said, it's partly influenced by my own insider perspective of working in further education, and also of being neurodivergent. I was actually diagnosed as an adult, so I'm still kind of processing that really, because once you are formally diagnosed, you have the diagnosis and then basically you're left to get on with it. So my my research was very much then partly influenced by my own biography, which is very difficult not to do that, full stop. So it was influenced by my the kind of rational design, and the execution of my research was influenced by my biography, and very much, to a certain extent, certainly when I was doing the data analysis, influenced by my neurodivergence. So in terms of how I process information, how I recall information, how I can make sense of things, that very much shaped my methodology, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But it's really important to say that, in any piece of research, particularly where there is an insider knowledge or perspective, or you're kind of close to the topic that you're researching, is that there's going to be a kind of relational and institutional story. My institutional story, I talk about this in the introduction of my thesis, was my early years experience, my formative years experience of not being diagnosed and being, on one hand, called very bright, but then on the second hand, struggling at times through education. So where does that kind of leave us? So I just wanted to give you a kind of wider sense. And I looked at this area as part of my, when I was doing my PGC in further education, which is really interesting. That's what sparked all of this, was that I did a small piece of research as part of my final dissertation. It was only 7,000 words, and you had to present a piece of research, and I looked at dyslexic and non-dyslexic teachers in the classroom. I did over non-participant observation, and I did interviews, and because I was interested to see, the dynamic in the classroom of for a neurodivergent teacher, and in this case it was teachers who were dyslexic, and how they navigated through their teaching and learning. And then from that, I then started a master's in 2007, and then my dissertation was looking, much bigger piece of work, was 20,000 words, and it was looking at how it's like a case study, almost like how one college middle managers and senior managers supported teachers with specific learning differences. So in my earlier work, and even in my PhD dissertation, is that the language mainly is from the biomedical model. I do start talking about neurodiversity and neurodivergence, but at the time, although the kind of neurodiversity paradigms and neurodiversity advocates and academics, that work was already starting to be out there, it hadn't filtered through in terms of education research. So most of it was talking about, the kind of using those terms like dyslexia, dyspraxia, but approaching it, when I say using those terms, for the biomedical model. So my research that I'll be sharing with you will be using the term specific learning differences. So the rationale really was for me, on the basis of the other pieces of research that I'd carried out, was that there seemed to be a gap in terms of either from the experience from the teacher about the support that was put in place, or from senior middle managers. There seemed to be a kind of lack of any policy or protocol to assist managers, the teacher themselves, senior managers, about how to support neurodivergent teachers. A lot of the research that was out there at the time when I started my PhD in 2014, was it? Yeah, it was. Was that a lot of the research that was out there was mainly focusing on subjective experiences of teachers who were dyslexic, dyspraxic, who were autistic. So it never looked at the kind of surrounding policy that might shape their experiences, such as policy around teacher professionalism, policy around teaching and learning, and so on and so forth. So there seems where there was research that looked at subjective experiences, it tended to focus on resilient strategies in teaching and learning preparation. So really the onus was on the teacher themselves to fix themselves in order to be able to do the role. So there was a lack of focus on policy and policy technology. So I'll just say a little bit about that. So there was a lack of focus at policy at the kind of what they call the macro level. So this is education policy, so policy that may be put in place by the Department of Education. And then there was policy at the kind of more meso level of the college policy. There tended to be the research tended not to look at that when looking at neurodivergent teachers, or even at policy at the kind of more micro level, at the department level within a school or college. And there was a lack of focus on how not having a policy, or policies that were in place, so something around, say, the lesson observation policy, and how that could be and how that can be enacted, and the technologies. So the technologies are the things that make it come, to be, and it's the process of the policy. So the lesson observation might be a policy, but the technique of that would be, things like doing learning walks. So that constant surveillance that's on teachers. So there was a lack of any research that looked at policy techniques and the effects of education policy and teacher professionalism. And it was also really unclear whether key policy generators and actors of policy, considered teachers with specific learning differences. And again, so for example, when the changes to the A level, when it went back to linear, I asked in my interview, so I've researched, which I'll talk a little bit about more in the methodology, but I did speak to a former policy officer from the Department of Education. I spoke to membership organisations around the further education sector, and principals who had attended training on the introduction of the new A level, and where they'd been consulted on the implementation about whether there'd be any conversation around that, on what that impact might be for neurodivergent teachers and learners. So my my hand has moved us along. So that's, really that kind of then shaped me, got me to think about my research. So the title for my research is The Construction of Teachers with Specific Learning Differences as Subjects in the English Further Education Sector, an exploration of contribution of policy techniques, policy process, and performativity. So I am going to talk a little bit about the, in terms of the working definition of performativity that I used. I was interested to know, so this wasn't a piece of research that in my recruitment I actively tried to recruit teachers that would come under that catch-all term of with specific learning differences. So in that was dyslexia, dyspraxia and dyscalculia. I was interested in anyone who worked in the further education sector, so that could be teachers, managers, and then I said those wider sector organisations around FE, and wanted to know, as individual, they enact with policy, everyday education policy, what were their experiences? So I'll take a little water pause there. So my theoretical framework and methodology. So my research methodology was heavily situated within the interpretist paradigm. So that's really around interpretists approaching research of wanting to find out the social reality of the individuals that are taking part in research. So I wanted to find out the social reality for those teachers, for those line managers, for those principals, for the leads on teaching and learning, for those senior policy managers and officers and directors of the wider FE sector membership organisations that I spoke to. I wanted to know their reality when it came to engaging with policy and the policy process. And so that's why I adopted an interpretivist methodology. Now, in terms of my theoretical influences, very much influenced by post-structuralists and postmodernists. Michael Foucault and Francois Lyotard very much influenced the research from that framework. And it was actually, I'll say a little bit more about that. So in terms of very much, I referred to Stephen Ball, the eminent education professor, in his reworking or the way he linked to Foucault and both Lyotard in his work. So in terms of looking at policy, Stephen Ball talks about looking at policy as text and the fact that any policy is not closed and open to interpretation, but also in linking to Foucault, looking at how policy exercises power and how it works alongside other policies to set what Ball refers to Foucault's term about a regime of truth. And so the lesson observation process is a good example of this. So there are policies or several policies in place that a college may adopt. And then this is about constructing a truth about what it is to be a teaching professional, what it is to say, what is good education. So it very much kind of shapes that. And then in terms of linking to Lyotard's, it was Ball very much referenced Lyotard's theoretical explanation about performativity. So this is really about how individuals, so a process is created in which individuals perform to kind of predetermined regime of standards and measures, and that sets the kind of criterion in which we work, but it also sets truth. So again, if we use the example of the kind of lesson observation, that sets the reality of this is the only way to measure, the only way that we should understand what makes good education. And then you have to think about the wider implications of that potentially for neurodivergent teachers. If you have something like learning walks in which someone can come in to your lesson at any time, it's very stressful for all teachers, but has particular challenges for some neurodivergent teachers. Certainly for me, in terms of creating, I used to find it used to create huge amounts of anxiety, and it used to take me a long time to regulate myself afterwards. So I think we need to, so it's looking at those kind of theoretical framework. And then my research process, so drawing on the kind of interpretive methodology, that my research sample was from 2 settings. So the first included 2 further education colleges, and they were selected from well, it was partly a purposive sample because I knew I wanted to go to further education colleges, and also it was a sample of, in some respects, convenience. So I reached out to some further education colleges that I was aware of, that I'd had some relationship with in the past, and that's how I recruited those colleges. And the second setting was a range of agencies and organisations that are part of the policy cycle process. So they're going to be, so Bauer will talk about the policy cycle process. So it's something that's continuous and ongoing, and that everyone who's part of that is a policy actor. So even teachers might feel that they don't have any agency when they actually do in their classroom about how they enact certain things. So it was kind of following from that. So there were semi-structured interviews. I did 15 interviews in total, and I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of the data analysis process. And of that 15, because in my title, so initially, because it refers to teachers with specific learning differences, that I did get when I was trying to recruit lots of pushback. I don't know anything about that, and I'd say you don't need to know anything about that. Actually, it might be even better if you don't know anything about it, because I want to understand how the policy and the policy process can subjectify teachers' specific learning differences. But there were 2 of the participants from the 2 colleges came forward that identified that had specific learning differences, and that actually added some real rich data in terms of the finding which we're going to look at, which is the cult of performative teacher. So I'm going to take a little breath there. Whew. Feel free to keep pausing this. And what I'm going to do, because I can see my face is obscuring some of the text, so the PowerPoint will be uploaded underneath as a PowerPoint, so you can follow it while listening to this. Okay, this is the bit. So research in motion. This is the sort of thing that no one tells you about when you're doing research. You're about to embark. Is you will need a huge dollop of endurance and tenacity. Am I saying that right? You will have to you have to really believe in your research to keep going back to people and trying to recruit when you're being ignored, or people are unsure, and you have to keep going back to them and reassuring them. So this research in motion. So I reached out to 37 participants in total, and that was through phone and email, which for me, I found very difficult. I find speaking to new people particularly taxing, and I did give myself some time. I learnt from some of the tools of feminology? It is feminology, where you have to take some time out afterwards or just before, I used to like try and bracket out my feelings about, you know, the emotion that it was raising and just reaching out. So I reached out to 37 people, eventually secured 15 interviews. It took over 2 years to carry out these interviews, and actually for one participant it took me, and this is what I mean by the endurance, and I'm not going to try and pronounce that again. Today seems to be one of the days I can't pronounce it, but it's the endurance, and it took sheer bloody mindedness to keep going back to participants, one in particular, and it turned out to be a great interview. And also a little tip, don't give up. The only time I ever gave up with a potential participant, is if they were like a flat no. Then I would go, right, you've said no. But for me, you need to say no, otherwise I'll just go, oh, there must be a door open, I can come back. And then one of the participants, I pursued them for 2 years. And what it turned out is, after I interviewed them, they turned around and said, oh, I'm so glad that was of use to you, because I was just so worried I'd have nothing valuable to say to you. And that's why you've got to keep pursuing, because it was very valuable. And I think it was a good experience for them. It was a good experience for me. So yeah, it took 2 years though to carry out that research. I did love the interviews though, I really loved it. And from those 15 interviews over 2 years, I transcribed the interviews myself, but I did think about, you know, whether I should get the transcription service done. But actually, my supervisor, and he was absolutely spot on, is you first start becoming familiar with your data when you transcribe. That's when you start picking things up. So it's really important that you do your own transcription. It's painful, but it's worth it. And for me, it brought up lots of emotions, because when I'm really tired or fatigued, my recall, I sometimes wasn't able to recall or hear more than 1 or 2 words, and so I had to keep stopping it and going back and stopping it and going back. So some of it felt a bit soul destroying. I had feelings of imposter syndrome, that why am I doing this? I can't do this. I'm unable to recall information. And all of those sort of emotions that kind of bubbled up. But I did it. Each transcript, though, was approximately 14 pages, roughly, if not more, 120 hours worth. So it's a lot of work, but absolutely worth it. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okay, another thing. So tools and techniques of my research. So you will find if you're a research student, or you're an academic yourself, or you're just someone who's interested in research, there's not much research out there that explains their methodology or how they went about doing their research. So you kind of have to carve your own way. And for me, as someone who is dyslexic and dyspraxic, I had that corpus of data of 120 hours of interviews, and all of those transcripts, that 14 pages times 15. I had to find a way of recalling that information. So I came up with these different tools and techniques. And I think that this was because it was related to my way of knowing myself, my neurodivergent ways of knowing. So other ways in which maybe someone who's neuronormative might be able to read things through and it all fits, I knew that wouldn't work for me. So I pretty much set up, it was almost like a 16-stage methodological process in terms of how I went about gathering the data and then analysing the data. So when it came to my literature review, I created these synthesis logs. So every piece of research I read, it's the image where it's in a table and the glasses are sitting over it. So they were my synthesis logs. And then it was like, what's the research saying? What are the key concepts? Does it relate to another piece of research? Which was great to do because I was really able to pick up themes when I was doing the literature part of the dissertation. And then in terms of gathering my data, analysing the data, I used Sonoset. So Sonoset is a kind of note-taking, but the good thing about that is I was able to colour code things and order the audio. I was also able to slow down the audio, and so quite easily, and I could add sub-headings and headings and tags, which helped me construct the first lot of my ideas around coding. Used a lot of highlighters, had to use like dictaphone. And then what I did was, in terms of my data analysis, I would then initially start taking discursive notes about going through each transcript, what they're trying to say, what they're trying to tell me. And this is lending from the kind of thematic analysis approach. What they're trying to tell me. What do they want me to know? And then went through it, and then came up with some initial points of, what keeps coming up. Accountability, lack of power, all those sort of things kept coming up. And then I started putting things on massive, great big flip chart paper. So get an aerial view. And I also put it in this, in the gold book. That's what that is, the yellow book. Images, the image there of, again, what was being said by these participants. And then from there I was able to form that kind of structure of then start looking at, drawing out codes. So I would say trust yourself, find your own way and what works for you. And so by the end of it, someone can say to me, what did participant I say about, and I'd be able to tell them straight like that. I got to know my data so well, inside out. And that's why my data analysis chapter is one of the strongest of my dissertation, because I just knew it inside out. So don't cut corners is my piece of advice. Okay, this is the have a go at data analysis. So the gems, I like lots of images to prompt me and make me think about things. So again, this you probably can't see very well here, so it's in the PowerPoint and you can enlarge it. But have a go at data analysis. So these are 3 participants. I want you to look at what are the participants talking about? What is important to them? So when you read this, what are they saying that's important to them? Can you identify anything, patterns? So that should be any patterns in the responses. There you go. It will be corrected in the it will be corrected. Sorry, I was going to pause it and then delete that and then start again, but no, this is real. This is what happens. And so in your PowerPoint, your version of it, that will say, can you identify any patterns in their responses? Okay. So let's be real about this, and we'll continue. So have a go at data analysis. So what are the participants talking about? What is important to them? Can you identify any patterns in their responses? So I'll read out the quotes, and these are taken directly. These are real quotes from my research. I think it is really important to have a question as a title. So there is an inquiry level approach to learning where students have to work on an answer to something, and the lesson is gathering evidence and figuring out how to answer that. I don't think it is unreasonable to say that if you look at where you are amongst your peers in this college, but also amongst your peers in the whole sector, the results your students are getting is not there. Those young people are not getting the results they would have got if they were with another teacher. The performance measures that are put in place by the department, the requirements of Ofsted push behaviour. So the performance measures, when they say department, is Department of Education, I should say. The requirements of Ofsted push behaviour. They make them behave in certain ways to chase what is defined as important. And what's important is that which is measured. Yeah. when in fact we might be measuring stuff that is completely irrelevant. We don't know. That is what we measure, so that is what we put our efforts into. So you can pause it there, just pause there, think about, write down, what are they trying to say? Are there any key words that keep coming back? What gems are you going to find? Okay. So that's just a little snapshot, but there were other in the other 12 scripts and all through the 15, there was other evidence of where these codes kept coming up, or these formations, and the codes kept coming up of performative technology. So remember, the performative is, where something, as Ball says, rather than memorable, education is where we've got outputs that are calculable, so where we measure things. So that's the performative technology, where we measure things through, ALICE scores, measure through results, students' results, measuring in terms of lesson observations, although we've moved away for some time now from graded lesson observations. There is still the descriptor of good, outstanding, and so on. So they're still measuring it, and in order to get there, you have to prove certain things. They're talking about accountability, who's accountable for something. So in one of the quotes, a participant was saying about if your students are not getting results the same as your peers, your colleagues' teaching groups, then those students are meeting out. So the accountability is obviously sitting with the teacher. Homogeneity. So the idea, that first quote, that was something that was quite common. A good teacher does this. They do bang, 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 bang. And they will have objectives. They will make sure that they link to British values and all of the other things that the requirements to do. They'll have a plenary, an opening, and so on and so forth. And then also there's this focus around, are all of those things intended to improve education experience for the learner, and in terms of you as a professional, teaching professional, to improve your subject knowledge, to improve the teaching professionalism, full stop, in the teacher profession, or is it just about proof? Are we just interested about gathering proof rather than really improving? So out of that, so when you add up all of these things, okay, so proof, outputs, accountability, homogeneity, and again, the focus more on proof rather than to improve, created this kind of cult figure that these teachers that I spoke to, and also in the kind of wider sector organisations, they were talking about this cult figure that I've never met on a consistent basis. We've all been a 1, but we've all been a 4. It just, in terms of the, the stress of everything, just managing the role, navigating through the role, then add that to, the added complexity of them being neurodivergent. So this is where then this theme came out, this kind of finding of the cult of the performative teacher. So the cult of the performative teacher. This is some of the kind of key points that came out that led to his finding. So the FE sector had a preoccupation with the performative ideal. So that's the measurement ideal of a further education teaching professional. And this cult figure seemed to be encouraged or created by policy, then put in place in terms of policy techniques around the lesson observation process, the lead up to the lesson observation process, what happens on the back of that. So that's the technology, their policy in I suppose in practice, and created this kind of cult figure. So, and it was embodied in the everyday resilience techniques adopted by teachers and managers in the further education sector. So instead of, although it's not that, as policy actors, they did question some of the things that they were expected to do, they still very much believe that, it very much did become a regime of truth, that the way of displaying yourself as, or saying you're an effective, a good teacher, was someone who could do X, Y, and Z. At the micro level, the individual teacher, they were all considered as a homogeneous whole, and this is, quite apparent. And so, and when I did speak to line managers in education and department managers, teacher learning managers, principals, assistant principals, and said to them about, what policies do you have in place for the workforce if they are neurodivergent, or and in this case the research, but or state that they have a specific learning difference. And really there wasn't one example given where it was, we have this policy specifically for staff and this process. It was, well, actually we do it on an ad hoc basis, of course we're very supportive, and there definitely was that sense that there was a real willingness, but there was nothing in writing, so there was no policy text. So the discourse from that would be, or the unwritten belief is that it's not necessary to have something like that in place, because the wider discourse around policy is that it's for the teacher to put the resilience strategies in place in order to manage. So because none of the policies recognise that there might be neurodivergent teachers, then there's only one conclusion, and that's to say, well, then teachers must all be the same, and they must be all neuronormative, because all the policies and processes support that way of processing. So how it is exacerbated further in terms of then what was really interesting, as I said, so this wasn't a piece of research that looked at too much about the subjective experiences, although, as I said, there was a corpus of research that was already available that I did look at. But the two neurodivergent teachers that I did speak out, they showed the perversity of this. So the neurodivergent teachers experience a kind of dual-layered subjectification. So they operate in an environment that fails to acknowledge their neurodivergence. Biomedical discourse and models seem to prevail, with the expectation is that they will put resilience strategies in place and fix themselves. And then they further use those resilience strategies. So they then use those strategies to, try and do what they could to, mask their neurodivergence. Although they did use examples where they did share with students, but it tended to be where they were sharing it with students was almost setting it up like, I must tell them that I am dyslexic, dyspraxic, because they need to know in case I make a mistake. So it's already got a kind of deficit feel to it, so I must make them aware. So only were they then having to lead up to this kind of cult of the performative teacher, to this ideal, then they had to be the ideal neuronormative teacher. So there was kind of bilaterally subjectified. And that was, encouraged and perpetuated in the policy and practice, not only on a local level, but on, as in terms of the micro and meso, but in terms of the macro level as well. So that gives you a little snapshot into my research. I have, as part of this as well, I've actually attached my whole thesis. You're welcome. If you want to, if you would like to read further, and also on my LinkedIn, I've got some articles that I've written which lend from my thesis, so you don't have to read the whole thing. And maybe you can have a look at those instead. But if you're interested in getting in touch, if you are a further education college and you're thinking, actually, this is really provokes me to think about what are we doing in our college to be neuro-inclusive, and you want to reach out and you need some guidance on how to write an inclusive policy, if you need training about creating a neurodiversity affirming workplace for your teaching workplace force, then please do get in touch. I have been Dr. Annemarie O'Dwyer. You've been very patient. And I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Neurodiversity in Education conference sessions. They're all pre-recorded, so please do have a listen. Thank you very much.